Gilmore. I am the vice president of this organization. President Lois has her priorities all screwed up, and she figured she'd rather stay a little longer in California for some reason or another than to be back with it here. I think Lynn is probably due to one of two things. Number one, people heard that I was going to be presiding and wanted me to show up. The other is they heard that you were going to be making a presentation on Silas Turnbo and decided to come, and surely it's not that, so it must be the fact that I'm presiding. Whatever the reason, folks, welcome. Thank you so much for being here. Could we take just a moment for a brief, do what we usually do and go about the room and get acquainted with people? Would you mind telling us who you are, your name, and where you're from, and without making a speech about it, anything else that you would like to say? Jerry, would you begin, and let's come down the table this way and go back down.
Jerry Gideon, Forsyth, Missouri. Lyle Owen, Brandon.
Hillary Brightwell, Springfield.
Mary Brightwell, Springfield. Vicki Roberts, Marion County, Arkansas.
Misty McPherson, Marion County, Arkansas.
Larry Hayes, Taney County.
Lynn Morrow, Jefferson City.
Pauline Barton, Branson, Missouri. And I'd like to ask, is Jim Davis here? Is there a Jim Davis here? Well, he called me and he said he was going to be here today. He wanted to hear this speech, so I guess he has the right here.
Kathleen Van Buskirk, Branson.
Ruth Asher,
Cape Fair.
Vern Angus, Marionville.
Jean Hendricks, Springfield.
Iowa Hartman, Kirbyville.
Fred Hartman, Kirbyville, no speeches. Doug Manning, Forsyth.
Okay, down at the end here, gentlemen.
Starlock, Branson West.
Althea Gary from Hollister.
Gene Johnson, Seattle, Washington.
Noma Johnson, Seattle, Washington. By the way, I'm Lois's cousin, and I
Oh.
belong to the Historical Society.
All right, very good.
Linda Myers speaking, Harlan, Missouri.
Good. Hurley. You've changed. You didn't used to be Hurley, did you? You have moved on.
Last fall.
Well, yeah.
I've been Hurley since then.
Never.
Hardy Ayers, Branson West.
Sue Davidson, Branson.
Gordon McCann, Springfield.
You want to say something?
I was just going to say that I came because my maiden name was Turnbo, Turnbaugh, and I saw it in the paper and was interested.
That's the way my surgeon spells his in Jefferson City.
He's my cousin.
Is he?
He's a orthopedic surgeon.
His bone and joint clinic.
Yeah.
Bob Miley, Forsyth.
Gladys Comstock, Stratford.
Vera Wood, Stratford.
Bill Wood, Stratford.
Lucy Combs, Branson.
Ray Faulkner, Oklahoma City. And I found about the meeting yesterday in the Crane Chronicle.
Good for the Crane Chronicle. All right. Well, thank you again. It's a good group. I'd like to have the secretary would Pauline, if you would read the minutes for me to present, not to introduce, because he doesn't need that, but to present Lynn Morrow, who will make have the program today on a new book that he and a colleague of his from Jefferson City, James Keith, have put together. The White River Chronicles of Silas Turnbo was published just this year by the University of Arkansas Press. It is a most significant document. It is a fine research document. Now, these Turnbo wrote many years ago, and his writings have been around for a long time now, but they have been around in some 28 notebooks lined up on a shelf, 28 notebooks on a shelf with 100 pages or so in each of them. without any particular organization except the index that Jim and Lynn did some time back. It's a daunting task for anybody that wanted to sit down and work with them. So we now have to add to the list of people who are particularly important in an understanding of the early Ozarks to the name of Henry Schoolcraft and the name of Vance Randolph, the name of Silas Turnbo, and of course, Lynn Morrow. Lynn?
Thanks a lot, Bob. In talking about Silas Turnbo, I feel like I'm in somewhat of a unique situation in terms of other authors and editors that have worked with one man's collection. As was mentioned earlier here today, one of the Turnbo cousins is here in Jefferson City. In the last few years, I've not only worked with Silas Turnbo's collection, one of his relatives has done knee surgery on me and back surgery, and just this last week put 7 stitches here in my sternum for me. So I feel like the Turnbo family has worked me over as well as me trying to deal with the Turnbo collection. One thing I've done today, I know some of you enjoy topographic maps. This map on the wall is simply the USGS topographic maps of the heart of the Turnbo collection in terms of the geographic space. You may want to take a close look at that for some of the, see how it fits together in terms of where families may be on the river, or I'm sure most of you know better than I do where some of your own people may be, but sometimes it's a little revealing to look at all that put together. And in the book there are some maps where we had produced that give the most common place names used in the stories, and I blew up some sketch maps. If you want to take one, take one. The ones of Missouri and ones of Arkansas, the 2 principal counties, containing Ozark and Boone and Marion. You can use those in your own work if you need to. This past week, I was trying to think about what I might say about Silas Turnbo. I came up with a program about 6 hours long. So when I was on the table getting stitched up Thursday, why I managed to whittle that down a little bit today. I'm going to do something differently than I normally do when I talk about some work that I've been in. I'm going to talk about maybe the history of a couple of these books that I've done. But more importantly, we're going to spend most of the time talking about things within the collection and what you can do with them. The product of this book is not the end of the story for Silas Turnbo and what he has to say. This is representative of some things that can be done. There's a great deal more, and that's basically what I'm going to talk about today. A few years ago, I did a book called The Connecticut Yankee and the Frontier Ozarks by University of Missouri Press, and it's very similar to the Turnbo book. But there are important differences, and these 2 books represent important things for the history of the Ozarks that we'll go over briefly. This writing by Russell is essentially autobiographical. It's much more literate. The man had a classical education. And although it deals with much of the same time period and same subjects, it's set in the southeast Missouri, primarily in the Arcadia Valley. But Turnbo's work is autobiographical only partially. It's really a work of a collective memory. There were dozens and dozens and dozens of people that Turnbo talked to, and one of the great strengths of his collection is saying who those people were, how he received the information, where he was, the geographic specificity. There are very few collections like Turnbo's that give that kind of information. And his collection has had its own idiosyncratic history, which all of you have in the quarterly some time back. I wrote an article about the collection itself that I won't repeat today, and I wrote an article and put in there about the Turnbo family that I won't repeat. In fact, most of it's contained in the introduction to this book. But in terms of trying to make decisions on how one decides to work on something like this, I did want to say that in 1977, when Marvin Tong negotiated the, or rather after Marvin Tong had negotiated the sale of the manuscripts to the Springfield Art Museum, Springfield City government got involved in a deal to take the manuscripts from the Art Museum to the Greene County Public Library. And the following year, is 1978, is when I first reviewed the collection. And not long after that, I reviewed the newspaper columns of Russell's writings in southeast Missouri. And one thing that had struck me several years after looking at collections all over Missouri and Arkansas, all kinds of particularly 19th century writings on the Ozarks and what's contained there, the biggest question that I had was who are the most commonly quoted voices of the Ozarks in the 19th century. Some of them have already been mentioned. Henry O. Schoolcraft, and he was here 4 months. Thomas Nuttall was here several months in Arkansas. George Fanshawe was here a few weeks, and Frederick Gerstacker was here a few years and left. But the thing about those 4 men, they all were highly educated people of their day. They wrote what's commonly referred to as travelers' accounts. They did not live their lives in the region, and I felt that there needed to be some representation, particularly for local history, of people that lived in the region. And so in 1979, I made the decision that when I got time, that these were the 2 collections that I thought were most important for southern Missouri Ozarks history, the Russell collection and the Turnbo collection. And so as time went on to the 1980s, I began to make preparation to produce them, and they are produced for reference work for libraries. That is, as I mentioned, it's not an end in itself. It's the books have things contained in the notes and in the layout to suggest ways that you might further enhance your own family history, your own local history, your own county history, and that's primarily what I want to talk about today. In making a decision to spend the amount of time that we've spent dealing with these collections, there was another thing that is different about these 2 books. Most people that edit collections come out of one discipline or one profession. It's either a folklorist or a historian or a geographer or someone of one background. One thing that always disturbed me in Ozarks writings was the fact that was so, and there weren't other viewpoints. I felt these collections lended themselves to some sort of natural world commentary that only a wildlife biologist, a conservationist, or someone in that area could provide the kind of insight. So when I began these projects, I began with Dan Saltz, and unfortunately he didn't live to see Russell come to fruition. And then Jim Keefe, who worked 34 years for the Department of Conservation, decided to be my partner on the recommendation of Saltz. And so that's why he is involved in this project. He is a specialist in 19th century weapons. You'll see a lot of commentary in the Turnbo book about all kinds of ball and powder, cap and gun, rifles and weapons. All that comes from Keefe. He is a wildlife biologist. His commentary in there about fauna and flora and so forth, I think dramatically brings a number of things to life that I'll mention a few later on today. Sometimes when I do these, I know I had a conversation earlier today about Desmond Walls Allen, who's a dynamo of energy in Conway, Arkansas, and has reprinted all of the Turnbo collection through her research business. And I had people ask me, well, why do I want to reinvent the wheel with Turnbo collection? And the answer is really quite simple, to me at least, and that is there is no commentary in other Turnbo publications. There is no context for what's happening in the stories, no explanation from a wildlife biologist or a folklorist or a historian or any other person who has looked at a wide range of literature to help further make commentary on what is contained in the document. I'll mention a few of those, and we'll get at that. And there are things in the Turnbo collection that other folks that I've been in contact with at various universities that they're very dramatic. It's a very rare collection in terms of some of the things that's there. And one of them would be, if you were reading a story about the Indians and the whites, there is a passage where Turnbo, repeating a story, mentions the Indians' top-sided notching. And you'd probably just read right over that as though it was just notching like anything else, but it's not. That is a very significant document in terms of the kind of notching that that did not exist in a widespread area for a very long period of time. It was notching, was picked up and copied on the East Coast. It was notching that Indians copied from whites, not vice versa. It was the quickest and easiest way to take round logs and put them together to notch them on the top. You go out and look at Matt's cabin or anybody else's notching, it's not on the top, it's on the bottom. Because if you want to build a good log house, you have got to square up that building with your wood techniques from the bottom of the log and not the top. So in this kind of small detail, there are 60 pages of notes in this book that try to bring those kinds of facts out. There's only two sources west of Mississippi where that little tiny fact is in published literature, and one of those two is the Turnbo collection. The other one's in East Texas. There's a lot of things in here about round log houses. If you have in your imagination, if you're writing about the Ozarks in 1830, 1840, you might visualize, like Matt's cabin, a square log house. Well, believe me, you wouldn't have seen them because they weren't there. And Turnbo is very specific about a lot of the wood techniques in domestic architecture. Put simply, in the time period that Turnbo is writing about, principally the antebellum period, we'll say from statehood to the Civil War, the kind of frontiersman that was here did not have enough tools in their carpenter bag to build a square log house. They simply couldn't have carried them, and they didn't. A square log house had been very, very uncommon. The cookhouse on Swan Creek would be an exception. By far and away, the huge majority of log houses before the Civil War were all round log houses. And there's a number of commentaries in here about that. Also, I don't care if it's Russell or me or Turnbo or anyone, anytime you sit down and produce a huge body of literature, you're not always going to get everything just right, factually right. I mean, there's always the interpretive area. But Turnbo is wrong about some things, and we put in commentary where he is wrong. There's a story in there about Colonel Henry Maxwell in 1850 running for state representative against Mike Yoakum, and Turnbo tells a story and tells some anecdotes of what a great race it was and how Mike Yoakum beat him. Well, Mike Yoakum did not beat Henry Maxwell. It was the other way around. Maxwell was a two-term state rep, and he was well known in northern Arkansas. And somebody along the line just got the political history mixed up. And so there's extensive commentary here about that sort of thing. But we every day when we meet, we try to present ourselves as the White River Historical Society, and there's no other collection that would fit that definition better than Turnbo's. And this book is only about represents only about 425 pages, about 2,500 pages that's in the library that Bob mentioned earlier at the Greene County Public Library in Springfield. But what's really important for this group, I think, is that 88% of that entire collection is set in Missouri and Arkansas, and almost 70% is in 4 counties: Taney, Ozark, Boone, and Marion. 70% of that entire collection is in the geographic heart of the region that we deal with all the time. The themes that we chose to represent in the book deal with common things that you're all used to in terms of pioneer settlement, hunting and wildlife, and the Civil War. As I had written about Turnbo previously in our quarterly, keep in mind when you're working with your family history or somebody else's family, notice the mobility that these folks had then, just like we have today. They may not have gone as far often, but they almost moved as often as some of us do. James Turnbo Silas's father, left Tennessee and came into Arkansas and moved north up into southern Missouri in 1840. In 1842, he went to Layton's Pineries. In 1844, he moved down to Beaver Creek. In 1849, they moved down the mouth of Elbow Creek. In 1853, they moved across Panther Bottom on White River. 1859, they moved upriver on White River in Marion County. 1865, they retreated to the Turkey Creek in western Ozark County. And then later that year back to White River. Well, there's 7 or 8 moves here in 25 years. Now, they're all in the White River neighborhood, or the Turnbo neighborhood. Nevertheless, they're living in different house sites. They're living on different pieces of property. And the way in which Turnbo recorded a lot of his reminiscences, it's very significant, the way that he records the trading of pioneer claims that I'll mention more about in a little bit. So the rest of the program will focus on themes or subjects. What can you expect to encounter if you explore this collection, or what can you think about for your own writing? Because we've got several people here that have already spent years and years in writing all kinds of things about the Ozarks, and the Turnbo collection has not near been worked over in the way that it can be. The first thing that I'll mention is a caution about the folk. You can pick up folklore literature or historians' literature, and there's these great general conclusions about images of the folk. Be real careful about what you think that the folk know, because they don't always know what you may read back into it. And there's a great story in Turnbo that I want to quote from that illustrates this very well. Now, if there's 2 families in the White River that you would think were the traditional folk that knew all about customary things, it would be the Heron and the Tabor family. And John Heron and Isaac Tabor were young men that went out on Big Creek in Taney County and told the story to Turnbo, what happened to them. They said, "We camped at a spring where Nelson South were settled later on. Some 200 yards from the spring, I saw a white deer and shot it. After carrying it to the spring, we removed its hide and entrails and cut the latter open to attract wild bees, and found a hard substance in the stomach, which proved to be a stone-like formation, nearly 2 inches in length, 1 inch broad and 1/2 inch thick. One end of it was slightly tapering, and very fine cells or pimples were all over it. It was a peculiar formation to be found on the inside of an animal. Thinking it of no value, we tossed it aside. Sometime afterward, I gave a description of it to Peter Marsh, and he told me that it was a madstone and offered me $5 for it, if I could find it again. My energies were so stimulated by the price offered me for the stone that I visited this same spring on several occasions and searched carefully for it, but never recovered it." Now, that's what I mean in terms of being careful about what you think the folk know, because not everybody has the same kind of knowledge. It depends, carpenters are going to know one thing, stockmen are going to know other things, row crop farmers are going to know something else. Try to be real careful when you look at Turnbo and all these things before you give certain characteristics to some of these families. Of course, it almost goes without saying that one of the great things, and this has been this is why the Turnbo collection is known somewhat, its ability to reveal further genealogy and family history. A couple of things I'm going to leave with Pauline for the Society Library. I'll leave a copy of both Russell and the Turnbo book. But more importantly, I'm going to leave 2 copies of a computer index. This index has indexed every single name in the entire Turnbo collection and where it's found by volume and page. It has indexed every single place name and where it can be found. It's all according to the layout in the Springfield Library. There's an index up there. This one is a little bit better than the one there. But for example, if you want to know what did Turnbo's informants have to say about Stone County, Missouri, all you have to do is go to this Stone County index, and every single reference in the collection is there. If you want to know what the Turnbo collection had to say about the Tabor family, go to the Tabors in here, and every single place the Tabors are mentioned will be an index. So by working through this index for your interest, at least in terms of people and place, cemeteries are in here, as Bob Miley's already worked with it. You can begin to very quickly and much more easily than in years past begin to get a grip on the many vast things that are in that collection. Of course, I think you'll spend very little time in the Turnbo collection, and you'll see right away that the thing that dominated the mind of mostly men that he talked to, and it's a male collection by far and away, and that is hunting. And remember that all of the great hunters in American history are Southerners. There are no great Northern hunters in terms of the popular literature of the 19th century. Daniel Boone and Davy Crockett and all the people in Turnbo's collection are all Southerners. It's that way all through the 19th century literature. Has anyone in here ever heard of C.F.M. Noland? N-O-L-A-N-D? There's a name that I would encourage all of you to get acquainted with. It's just a tragedy that he's not known in Missouri. He's a famous person in Arkansas. But to give you an example in terms of the national view, why Turnbo's work is important. When the Territorial Land Office was opened at Batesville, Arkansas in 1818, there was a Virginia family by the name of Nolan that got the political appointment to the land office. Mr. Nolan brought his young, late teenage son, Bent Nolan, with him. The father only spent about 18 months in Batesville, missed the family, and went back east, but the son decided he'd stay. The son already had a classical education. He had all the right political ties. He was a very literate person. He studied law under Judge Bates, and he became the leading village elder of Batesville, Arkansas. He became part of the Arkansas political machine. He became friends with every national political figure in the South, including Henry Clay, Andrew Jackson, Wade Hampton in South Carolina. All the dignitaries knew Nolan, but why did they know Nolan? Nolan was a great hunter. He loved to go with the locals down White River and cane breaks, up White River as far as War Eagle over here, and he began to write about his experiences on White River. He sent his writings to New York to a man named Porter, who owned the Spirit of the Times. And in antebellum America, the Spirit of the Times was like Outdoors Life or Field and Stream or those great outdoors magazine. It was the #1 national magazine on hunting and fishing in the United States. And it is absolutely loaded with stuff from the Ozarks and in particular Arkansas. The characters, Pete Whetstone, there's some academics that have done some things with this, but I mentioned it today in that from our perspective, the local history, that whole collection of Nolan's needs to be examined in fine detail for the stories that complement Turnbo. Perhaps some of the same people are involved, but it's also, Nolan is important really in another way that I'm very much interested in, and that has to do with the origin of the name Ozark itself and where Turnbo's cokers played an important part. In the 18th century, Arkansas Post was the colonial capital of Louisiana, way down on the lower White River. One of the things that did at Arkansas Post, it was the bear rendering post for the hunters that came downriver out of the flatland delta of Arkansas, and that's where they got the bear oil and lard and meat and so forth ready for the New Orleans market. As time goes on, the bear hunting enterprise, and you have to remember, on the far western reaches of the frontier, the #1 masculine person is the bear hunter. It's not the deer hunter, not the panther hunter, not the wolf hunter. It is the bear hunter. He is the stud of the backwoods in any estimation of the culture of the time. And moving up White River from Arkansas Post were the bear hunters going into the interior. The next great place that they processed bear was Oil Trough Bottom, which is down near Jackson and Jacksonport, Newport, Arkansas, and the cane breaks there. The next place they moved was the mouth of Big North Fork River. The next place they moved was the mouth of Bear Creek in modern Boone County on the White River on this map. And who was at the mouth of Bear Creek? It was the Cokers' land. And that's what the Cokers were doing when Henry O. Schoolcraft came upriver. A century-long tradition of bear hunters moving up the White River, out of the flatland, into the mountains, and you begin to have people like the Schoolcrafts, the Fanshaws encountering them, the name Ozark came with them. The name Ozark, or at the bend, starts to appear in trading documents as it moves right up the river, right up the various bends of the White River, and by the time you get the Little Easterners there, and trade connections are connected with St. Louis, the name moves northeastward. It moves northwest and then northeastward to St. Louis, because that's where the St. Louis Indian Superintendency was, and that's where all the hunters were financed out of treaty arrangements and so forth. But a lot of that is subject for another writing, but nevertheless, this literature that's contained within Turnbo is very important. Story. I won't dwell on these. I really could do this for 6 hours probably. But the bear stories, some of them you might think are tall tales, and they probably have aspects of tall tales. There's a thing woven in Turnbo's tales that I want you to look for. There's something about the Ozarks region and its karst, its geologic karstness, that's really important to hunting. One example is in Greene County, for example. Greene County's surface karst deposits is the largest of any county in the Ozarks. Because those sinkholes developed, there were natural ponds there. That's why Greene County became a marshaling point in the stock trade out of Oklahoma and Texas in the mid-19th century, because they had all this surface water, but it was there because of the karst system. And the karst system and all these sinks creates lots of pits. And these pits were used by hunters who later turned them into pen traps. And if you go into any rock shelter, any cave, you'll also, I'm an old spelunker, I've been through lots of these things. You go into any kind of rock shelter of any size at all, you're going to start crawling through some of these collapsed areas. Well, there's this great tale that Turnbo tells about one of these guys being in the cave. He's got his bear dogs with him, and he decides he wants to go into the cave after the bear, but he doesn't want the dogs in there messing up the fight. So he blocks the dogs with a big piece of pine chunk at the front of the cave, and he gets a pine torch and he's crawling on his belly. This is a real narrow passage, but he has to crawl down through a sink. It's a collapsed part of the cavern. He crawls down, it's real dark, he's already shot at the bear. What he doesn't find out till later, he shot the bear in the mouth and knocked his teeth out. But he finally encounters the bear, and he shoots the bear again. And but he can't turn around because the passage is so narrow. There's only one way in and one way out. He's got to back out. It's like his feet is toward the front of the cave, so he's backing out, and he backs into this sink, and he goes below the floor of the cavern. Well, the bear's mad, and the bear's, crawling. He's trying to stay out of the way, the paws and so forth. And the bear comes over the top of him. But the hunter is protected because he's down in the sink. So he's able to bring out his bowie knife and kill the bear by running the knife up above him. And Turnbo describes all the blood coming down out of the bear all over his clothing and into the sink. And he's just awash with blood and has to go to this incredible amount of trouble to get the bear off the top of it and then back out of the cave. Well, some of that may be a tall story, but nevertheless, you couldn't tell that story in other regions of the United States that didn't have a karst system for the hunter to get in this collapsed sinkhole. And these stories are full of the use of these pits for hunters. I mean, these bear hunters just could not have done a lot of the things they did were it not for sinkholes. The portraits that Turnbo gives are really quite incredible. If you read many of these stories, I know some of the criticism I've received for this book has to do with, Lynn, how could you publish those cruel things that those people did to those animals? They just thought I've done a terrible disservice by bringing a lot of these stories, many of which are worse than Turnbo, about what man does to an animal. Well, all that has to do with whether or not, or what the degree to which you want historic context and what's going on, I suppose, from my point of view. And I agree, a lot of it's pretty harsh and a lot of it's pretty nasty in terms of what these hunters would do to animals. And they include all kinds of images from slaughtering deer in the snow and what they do to wolves in pen traps. And I'll just mention, if you want a really good project, mind what Turnbo has to say about pen traps and how important it is in hunting. There's a national article for you. There, you could put together a really good piece of work in all of the ways in which they utilize these sinks and build pen traps in them. There's one that I want to mention in terms of something that sounds a little bit different, I think. The images that Turnbo gives, in my view, are also worth noting. There's all kinds of images that you can look at in film and in novels and histories. There's lots of images in these Turnbo writings that you have not seen in film or in other fiction. And this is the kind of thing that a traveler's account like Schoolcraft never picked up because they weren't there long enough. And for example, if I can find it here, I may stumble a little bit, but I was so busy reading the scandal sheets this morning in Jefferson City about our office, I ran off and left my book that I had all marked up. So anyway, I'm using the one I have to leave the society here. But he tells a story or recounts about the Sanders family in Ozark County. And I think this kind of image is something that brings great presence to family history and local history when you're trying to think about day-to-day activities that these people were involved in. Turnbo writes, Mr. Sanders says that his father was a deer hunter, and he has known him to have as many as 40 head of deer in the smokehouse in wintertime when snow covered the ground. His main time to kill deer was when it was cold weather with plenty of snow. When he would start out to hunt deer while snow was on the ground, he would have us children to follow him with horses and ropes. And when he would kill a deer, we would tie a knot in the hair of the horse's tail, then tie one end of the rope around the deer's dead neck, and fasten the other end to the horse's tail above the knot and drag the deer home. The snow would prevent the hair on the deer from being rubbed off and not spoil the hide. And that's very important. Again, depends on what time of the year. It's just like loggers want to log in winter when they got ice and snow on the ground so they can move that timber out of the woods. If you're a deer hunter, you want to hunt when you can move that carcass very quickly across the snow. This was our daily work as long as snow lay on the ground. I have brought many dead deer home in this way as father would kill them. When a big lot of furs, pelts, and deer horns were accumulated, my father would load them into an ox wagon and take them to St. Louis and exchange them for salt, coffee, and other needed supplies. Well, that's the kind of thing I never saw in Walton's on TV, and I've never seen any other traveler's account. The Turnbo's accounts are full of that kind of really special detail about family enterprise in making a living off the land in the woods, whether it's hunting bears or deers or some other game. Now something a little bit different that upsets some of my environmental friends. I think rather than read it, I'll just sort of tell you about it. Again, something that the Schoolcraft accounts never get around to telling you. While Schoolcraft is responsible for really the first producing Eastern literature that produced the first serious stereotype of what Southern culture was like in the Trans-Mississippi West, creating a lot of negative images. What Schoolcraft and others didn't ever get around to was talking about backwoods capitalism and how proficient these hunters were and how they capitalized upon the resources they had and how market hunting was simply the best economics pursuit in the woods. It was a lot more stable than speculating in mine, timber, or land. If you wanted to make money in 1830 in the Ozarks, you made it big game hunting. And there was plenty of population here in which to do it. Turnbo has a great story about, well, he has lots of stories about market hunting, but it's the one about Crooked Creek, and he goes on to talk about things in White River. And when the season was right, a bunch of men would get together and have a fire hunt on White River. Well, if you're going to go out, you may as well make a party and have a race, as Turnbo's jargon would call it. They go down to White River at night with their pine torches and see how many deer they could kill. But the way in which it was done, you'd have two parties of men in two canoes, and they would float down quietly. You can imagine this in the middle of the night, real quiet. And of course, the torches, it's just like flashlights. You get the deer's attention with a pine knot torch, and he's just going to stand there. And so they slaughter the deer as they're floating down rivers. And as the deer is killed, they had ropes with them. They tie them to stones, tie them to deer, and sink the deer to the bottom of White River. But they would have it marked, the rope tied to a tree on a bank so they know where it was. So they'd float for hours, leading a slaughter of dead deer that was now underwater, but marked. Then they would camp, and they were keeping tally as they went down. In this one story, one canoe kills 10, the other canoe kills 9. Well, they wait till daybreak when they have lots of good light. Then they get in the river and walk and push canoes back upriver, pulling the dead deer out of the water, skin the deer, throw the carcass on the side, and as Turnbo says, all the varmints and the crows would get all the meat. All they wanted were the skins. And so they would push the canoes back upriver and bring the 19 deer hides back home. Well, this collection is just full of that kind of thing. But it's also, it's market hunting, it's capitalism, it's sport and recreation, but it is just part of that culture at the time of that generation. If you ever wondered where all the game went, it's not hard to imagine after reading a number of these kind of stories where you have that kind of competition. It's just like the July 4th story at Forsyth, when they killed over 3,000 different species of bird and game and so forth, and cut the ears off of them and brought them in to see which creek valley won that kind of competition. And of course, the winner was supposed to, rather the loser was supposed to buy the whiskey for the day. But the hunting thing in both the Russell book and the Turnbo book, one reason that I'm interested in it historically is that hunting in the southern United States is another one of those very large subjects. There's never been a big book on southern hunting. There's a lot of simmering around in various history departments and geography departments about the need for it and so forth. But when that work is done, the Turnbo book will be used, I assure you. And it's because of the successes of the modern conservation movement, really, that's beginning to force a number of modern writers to think more about what hunting meant historically. And maybe we'll give that big book on southern hunting one of these days. And if they do, they'll look at the pin traps that Turnbo has in his writings. A number of years ago, about 20 years ago, there was a big argument that was begun by a number of academics talking about the fur trade and what Indians really thought when they were killing animals. And the argument basically had to do with the Indians blamed the whites for bringing all kinds of things, including disease. Some of this disease showed up in animals, and some of the argument was that Indians pursued game so aggressively because they were so mad that they wanted revenge against that part of the universe, that part of the world, and it gave them an extra rationale to slaughter deer or beaver or whatever it was. Contained within Turnbo is the same argument, except it's whites. And in his stories, there are tales in here, again, with the use of the pen trap, particularly when wolves destroyed stock. The phrase is used that the frontiersmen wanted revenge against nature, is the term, revenge against nature. And that's where you really encounter some of these real brutal tales of trapping a wolf and skinning it alive to see how far it may go before it drops dead. Or the wolf may be so beat up in the hunt that you would tie the hind legs of a wolf, the hind legs of your best fighting dog, and turn them loose, see who wins. There's all kinds of brutal contests of animal against animal that man stages in terms of this revenge against nature. And the Turnbo collection lends itself to various kinds of discussion that goes on. I know among those wildlife biologists and so forth that are interested in that sort of documentation. And this collection is very good because Turnbo is very careful there, like he is elsewhere, in telling where this took place, who told the story, details about this kind of revenge within the hunt. And all of this is wrapped up, of course, in what's commonly known as blood sport, or the it's used all through literature in terms of the entertainment that one gets from blood sport. One of the really interesting things to me in terms of image that you haven't seen in film or other fiction that Turnbo talks about, and that's mass migrations of various species. There's a story in here where they're out at a hunting camp, and the fire gets cold, but they've camped on a rock shelter, and didn't pay attention where they were, and before they knew it, the copperheads were everywhere in camp. And the story goes on about how they killed 45 copperhead camp that night and moved. I personally don't think that's tall tale, because there's too many other things about these kinds of tales out in the wilderness where it really is a primeval wilderness. That there hasn't been man's invasion on a large scale in a lot of these places that these guys are talking about. And I want to read one short passage about this that I think is very dramatic, again, that you do not find in travelers' accounts. Oh, by the way, you'll find this in the notes, like this story has a title of A Swarm of Diamondback Rattlesnakes. There were never any diamondback rattlesnakes, they're all timber rattlesnakes, but that's one thing Jim Keith sorts out for you in the various kinds of notes. But there were some hunters down in Madison County around Huntsville that decided to go on a fall camp hunt. They want to go over Kings River, set up camp for about 3 weeks, and what they're doing is market hunting. They're getting ready to slaughter the game so they can load the wagons and go to St. Louis like Mr. Sanders over in Wick Creek in Ozark County did earlier. Well, they take off and they travel for a while, and Dave Russell, Turnbo says, was an excellent shot at long range. And they saw some deer in the distance jumping around in the grass. And one of the men said, well, Dave, hit it. Take a shot. But just before he was ready to pull the trigger, the deer began to act in a queer manner by jumping high. Then it would go sideways a few yards and leap up and kick as if something had struck its legs. Phelps says, Dave, don't shoot. The deer might be snake bit. And Mr. Russell lowered the muzzle of his gun, and the little buck increased its speed to a fast run and was soon beyond our view down the mountainside. Our curiosity being aroused, we all went to the spot where the deer had jumped around so, and was astonished at seeing a large number of diamondback or timber rattlesnakes crawling on the ground, and they all seemed to be traveling from War Eagle River toward Kings River. The length of the reptiles ranged from 15 inches to nearly 5 feet in length. We picked up clubs and stones and killed rattlesnakes until we all became sick from inhaling the odor from them and had to quit work and went back to the wagons and drove on. Well, that is an incredible description, and I think it brings great presence to the spontaneity of what can happen out on the antebellum Ozarks frontier. You're liable to encounter most anything, and there are several stories in here and in the Russell book about mass migrations. It's snakes, it's squirrels. It's well known in all kinds of outdoors conservationist literature, but nobody has ever to this day, wildlife biologists haven't got a clue what was going on here in terms of, did the habitat change? Did they need to move a certain amount of mileage to get into another habitat? It's one of those unexplained categories in the history of wildlife, trying to account for why these very species get together in hundreds and thousands and move large or long distances across the land. Another thing that's related to this that was brand new to me, I don't know if it is to any of you all, but I was glad that Jim Keith was able to help me get it explained, and it has to do with centipedes. I was astonished at the size of centipedes reported in the Turnbo collection. I'm used to, little things for centipedes. But apparently, in the 19th century, in undisturbed areas of large glades, centipedes grew to a very large size, well over a foot in many cases. And where, if you're a 20th century person and you pick up this business and hear about centipedes, you're going to say, these guys are, they're telling one now. This can't possibly be true. But it's one of those things on further investigation is supported in other historical literature and by wildlife biologists. And the reason you don't see them today is because the size of the glade habitat has been reduced so much. And it's a loss of a certain kind of environment where giant centipedes could grow to maturity to a foot or longer. And of course, the reason that the pioneer folks were afraid of them is just like, whether you're an adult or a child, boy, they could really bite. You get a centipede that's 12 inches long. In here, Turnbo's informants talk about the centipedes stinging them. They don't sting. They have jaws, as Keith explains in the notes. They bite. They don't have a sting. But I imagine a 12, 14-inch centipede could probably lock on you pretty good. But it's another thing that if you look, when you see the footnotes and that kind of a story, look at the commentary for what Keith may have to say about the outdoor world. There's lots of fun things in here about children. Kids on the frontier like to get outside and get into mischief, just like they do today. One of my favorite ones, particularly with, I was just recently in southeast Missouri, and every time I go there, I swear there's another 5,000 canoes on the rivers over there. But along with inner tubes and all sorts of homemade craft to float down the current or some other place. There's this great story in here about a giant turtle. And whether stories about giant turtles and small turtles and what people do to them. But in this particular one, they hooked onto a turtle, and of course the turtle's in the water underneath, and the turtle starts pulling the canoe and pulls the canoe 40 yards before they can get it stopped and before they get their guns and can kill the thing. By the time they drag it out of the water, the thing is so huge that they decided to go to the barn and get the scales and bring them down to see what it weighs, because they'd never seen anything like it. It weighed 125 pounds. And again, when I first saw that, I thought, well, I got to have this checked out. And again, after checking with the wildlife biologists and so forth, and indeed that is possible in terms of the environment that the White River had in the 1840s and 50s. But the story goes on to say that they hung the turtle up and let all the flesh rot and fall out of this great, huge shell. Now you can imagine a 125-pound turtle, pretty good size, but the shell that was left, and then the kids went down, got the shell just like you'd get an inner tube, and would crawl inside of it just to see if they could float the river, and indeed it would float, and used it just like you would an inner tube on rivers today. Again, that's something travelers' accounts are not going to pick up, that kind of play, that again, these children are having fun with the environment and having fun with what is there to have fun with. There's another story. Again, if you pay close attention to what Turnbo says in his details about housing, you'll learn a lot of things about what was there close at hand. There's a story about children in yellow jackets in here, and these kids, I take it for the story, they're about 10 or 12 years old, and they're out in the woods, and the one brother causes a hornet's nest to fall down on the other one, and of course just gets the bejesus stung out of him so bad that the mother has to take the one child and put him to bed, and he's in bed for 3 or 4 days. He can't even get up. Well, then sometime after that, the other brother that didn't get stung, the one that would cause the mischief on the other one, they decide they want to do some crawling around under the house. But notice what Turnbo says about the house. They crawled under the house between the sleepers that were on the ground. That means there's no foundation. There's no pier foundation of rocks that gets the floor off the house. This house is sitting right down on the ground. So it may be 8 inches, 9 inches, 10 inches off the ground, just enough for a little kid to get in there and squirm his way between those sleepers under the floor. Well, this kid gets in there under the floor, and the next thing he knows, he's knocked a yellow jacket nest off because it's dark and the nest falls on his back. Well, it's like the guy in a sinkhole with bear hunt. There's only one way out. He can't turn around. He's got to back out. And of course, the other kid doesn't want him to get out. And he's trying to back out underneath the house, and the Yellow Jackets are really raising Cain with him. Really, he's screaming and yelling, and tells about how the mother in the old house would have been able to lift the puncheon floor and pull him out because they didn't tie down the puncheon floors in those early round log houses. But this was a lot better house. They moved into better housing. They had the puncheon floor pegged, so she couldn't get it up. She had to run outside and get the kid by the ankle and pull him out. And of course, the Yellow Jackets were just all over the place, and then he had to go to bed for 3 or 4 days. But the whole imagery about that kind of a tale of the kind of mischief that kids can get into on the antebellum frontier, again, is something that Turnbo is really strong in telling these common, what, you know, to them was common everyday tales that he brings, I think, to a certain amount of life that's worth having recorded. One of the really good projects that one of you may want to consider the Turnbo collection has to do with authorship. I've spent enough time with the collection that when Turnbo writes the story, in my opinion, the story is better when he is the author. When he was either there himself, or when he's has experienced the tale somehow, as opposed to the way that he receives the story from all his informants and compiles it. One of the projects that needs to be done with that collection in Springfield, that needs to be sorted out. There needs to be a sorting out of Turnbo's writings just himself, as opposed to those that the Green family gives him, or the stories Alan Turnbo gives him, or the Herons, or the Tabors, or the whomever. And I think, again, this goes back to kind of the local stories. If all this collection was duplicated and sorted out according to locale, a lot of that would begin to come to light. And in that, you would find that after the Civil War, when Turnbo was still a very young man in his late 20s, 27, 28 years old, Alan Turnbo was a man a generation older than him. The Turnbos had lived down on White River in the same neighborhood that they did, and you would see, if you looked at the collection, that Alan Turnbo gave a lot of stories to Silas Turnbo. And as early as the early 1870s, Turnbo's parents died in 1868 and 1870. By 1872, Turnbo is going back to the river bluffs on White River and taking Alan Turnbo with him. And they're standing up there talking about the way things used to be before the Civil War. And Alan Turnbo gives Silas many tales about his family's adventures up and down the river before the war. But very quickly, the point of this is that very quickly after the Civil War, this young man's mind, that is Turnbo's mind, has been turned to the past. And he's already collecting these tales in his generation from the old timers. Of course, I mean, Alan Turnbo's only about 50 years old then or so, but nevertheless, he'd grown up on White River. But Turnbo, Ned Coker is another one, gives Silas Turnbo lots of material. Captain Bud Wood, that served in the Confederate infantry, Silas Turnbo, gave him lots of material. One of the things I think, in terms of authorship, this needs to be sorted out. Who gave Turnbo what? And we may begin to find out some new things of who was the great bear storyteller, or who was the one that really liked to talk about the mischief that the kids would get into. Who were the ones that really wanted to dwell on the Civil War? You can only find that out really unless you sort this authorship business out in a very detailed way. And one thing that he'll tell you, dealing with the Bachmans and the Greens, for example, that they were all great hunters. Every man in the family was a great hunter. He had wonderful tales to tell about the Bachmans and the Greens. Well, what else about the Bachmans and the Greens? I think if you use this kind of an index, you can fill out everything that's in here about Bachmans and the Greens, and maybe there's other things that may come to light about them. There's another kind of information that's very rare in this book. If you're doing family history, you're used to going down to the recorder deeds in the courthouse. You might want to go see Jerry, see Katie Clarkson over at Forsyth. Try to look up some land records and see where the family was. Well, you get down here in these border counties, and you will find out that you may not have many land records that go back very far, and you can't find these people on the land. Turnbo is really good about placing people specifically on the White River or nearby. Pretty, not exactly, but you can at least get in the neighborhood. You can at least get in the township. You can get in a section most of the time, or a lot of the time, with a bunch of these relations. And what he does that I think is very interesting to me, he'll give you a little thumbnail sketch about these buying and selling of government claims. He'll go through 4, 5, 6 families before anybody entered a legal patent to the land. And these guys are moving up and down the river and in and out of the tributaries. Now I'll tell you why this is important. Just think about Douglas County, for example. The first legal patent in Douglas County was 1847. There's all kinds of people around the Douglas County geography prior to 1847, just like there was in Marion County or modern Boone County or any of these other places. And he focuses on the big bottoms on White River when he does this. He focuses on Bull Bottom, Panther Bottom, Magnus Bottom, Buck Bottom, and all these great large fields that were the prime settlement areas in the 1820s and 30s and so forth. And he has lots to say about who was in and who was out and the rotation of these claims. And in literature like this is the only place in a collection like this that you will ever find that kind of information. And one of the interesting things about Arkansas, people like to say that the state line doesn't make any difference in regional studies. Like in news form, it really does, and there's lots of ways that it does, and this is one way. In Arkansas, on the open range, you receive a tax credit. You do not have to pay a personal tax if you build a house on